Welcome to World Missions University's Minor Prophets, Bible 2:12. This is an exploration of the prophecies after the exile. In preparation for this class, you should read each of the minor prophets after the exile, as well as their notes and outlines by J. Vernon McGee. Those include Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. By the time you finish with this class, you will describe the meaning of each of the prophets' names where given, the significance of each of their prophecies, and their place within the history of Israel. In order to better understand their place in the history of the return from exile, it's good to look at each of the Persian kings, the years they reigned, and their actions in relation to the returned remnant. For example, we begin with Cyrus, one of the most important. He ruled from 539 till 530 BCE, and in 538 he issues a decree allowing the return to Palestine. This is recorded in Ezra 1 through 6. The two prophets at this time are Haggai and Zechariah. The next is Cambyses, who ruled from 530 through 521. Next we have Darius I, who ruled from 521 until 486. And in 520, the prophet Haggai preaches a message of rebuke after 15 years of activity. Also in 516, the temple is finally completed. Xerxes rules next from 486 to 465 BCE, and this is where we find the story of Esther. Finally, we have Artaxerxes, who ruled from 465 until 523. The second return happens under Ezra. This is recorded in Ezra 7 through 10, and then the third return under Nehemiah, recorded in Nehemiah 1 through 6. We also see the last of the prophets, Malachi. Haggai was the first of the post-exile prophets, and as such, ministered to the returned remnant. One of the important things you're going to notice about these prophets is that they rarely talk about the worship of idols like their predecessors did. Idol worship was a main theme of the pre-captivity prophets, but the 70 years of captivity in a foreign pagan land all but cured Israel of idol worship. Haggai was in the first group of 50,000 to return to Judah from Babylon. This, as you remember, was first permitted by Cyrus, king of Persia. Haggai is closely linked to the ministry of Zechariah. We date Haggai to about 520 BCE. Haggai 1:1 mentions the second year of King Darius on the first day of the 6th month. Verse 15 says, the 24th day of the 6th month in the second year of King Darius. Chapter 2 verse 1 says, on the 21st day of the 7th month. Verse 10, the 24th day of the 9th month in the second year of Darius. Verse 18 and 20 mention the 24th day of the 9th month. All of these events carefully documented in the year 520 BCE. The primary task was rebuilding of the temple. I like to point out that logic would dictate that they rebuild the walls first, provide some sort of protection so that they could rebuild the temple in some modicum of security. But the remnant knew wherein their real safety lay. They rebuilt the house of God first, their strong tower, their fortress, then later provided something for their God to use to further protect their city. Haggai also preached about the ongoing consequences of disobedience to their primary task. The people had been inactive about reconstructing the temple for 15 years due to some unforeseen resistance from their near neighbors. The book is short, the outline is straightforward. The first section, the Lord's warning to his people in chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. The second, the people's reaction to God's warning in chapter 1, verses 12 through 15. And the third, the Lord's response to his people in chapter 2. Next is Zechariah. His name means whom Jehovah remembers. He is the son of Berechiah, whose name means Jehovah remembers, and the grandson of Iddo, whose name means the appointed time. Iddo is also mentioned in Nehemiah 12:4 as one of 22 priests who returned with Zerubbabel from Babylon to Judah. Zechariah was a priest called to the prophetic office. He ministered between the years 520 and 518 BCE. His purpose was to minister encouragement and hope to those who would return to Palestine from Babylon. Zechariah began his ministry 2 months after Haggai spoke to the people about resuming the construction of the temple. As you read the book, you will find it has the character of an apocalypse. His visions, he was a seer, you see, resemble the books of Daniel and Revelation. Zechariah has more messianic prophecies than any of the other minor prophets. The book is of medium size among the minor prophets. The outline is fairly straightforward. The first section, an introduction, in chapter 1, verses 1 through 6. The second section is 8 night visions in chapter 1, verse 7 through chapter 6, verse 8. They include a man among the myrtle trees in chapter 1, verses 8 through 17, 4 horns and 4 craftsmen in verses 18 through 21, the Messiah present and Jerusalem rebuilt in chapter 2, verses 1 through 13, Joshua in filthy garments in chapter 3, a candlestick and olive trees in chapter 4, the flying scroll in chapter 5, verses 1 through 4, the woman in the ephah in chapter 5, verses 5 through 15, and a Gentile invasion in chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. The third section is a historic interlude, the 4 messages of Zechariah in chapter 7 through chapter 8, verse 23. First, questions concerning a religious ritual, that is fasting, in chapter 7, verses 1 through 3. And then a threefold answer, starting in chapter 7, verse 4, through chapter 8, verse 23. When the heart is right, the ritual is right. When the heart is wrong, the ritual is wrong. And then God's purpose concerning Jerusalem, unchanged by any ritual. The last section is the 2 prophetic burdens of Zechariah in chapter 9 through chapter 14, verse 21. The first burden, prophetic aspects connected with the first coming of Christ in chapters 9 through 11. And the second burden, prophetic aspects connected with the second coming of Christ in chapters 12 through 14. Malachi was the last of the post-exile prophets. He's also the last we will see of prophetic messages for the next 450 years until we see the ministry of John the Baptist. Malachi ministered about the year 430 BCE. John's ministry begins about the year 25 CE. Malachi's name means my messenger. He ministered at the same time as Nehemiah, and in fact, have some of the same messages as Nehemiah. For example, both complained that while the temple had been completed, it was being misused in Malachi 1, 7 through 10, and Nehemiah 13, 10 through 11. Both complained of corruption in the priesthood in Malachi 1, verse 7 through chapter 2, verse 9, and Nehemiah 13, verses 1 through 9. Both condemned intermarriage with the heathen in Malachi chapter 2, verses 11 through 16, and Nehemiah chapter 13, 23 through 28. Both warned of the neglect of the offerings of God in Malachi 3, 8 through 12, and Nehemiah 13, 10 through 13. Malachi's primary purpose is to instill into the remnant a proper view of God. The situation was this. The remnant had been back in Palestine for several generations, for about 100 years. This people were more responsive to the things of the Lord than those before the captivity. However, Israel had again started to backslide. This backsliding would continue until we see the religious and political circumstances that created the hypocritical Pharisees, Sadducees, and scribes at the time of Jesus. Malachi, his method was unique. First, he would quote a declaration or questions that God asks Israel, such as in chapter 1, verses 6 through 8. It is you, O priests, who show contempt for my name. Then Malachi would give Israel's sarcastic answer. But you ask, how have we shown contempt for your name? Finally, Malachi would give God's equally biting, sarcastic, and telling reply. You place defiled food on my altar. When you bring blind animals for sacrifice, is that not wrong? When you sacrifice crippled or diseased animals, is that not wrong? Try offering them to your governor. Would he be pleased with you? Would he accept you? Says the Lord Almighty. Malachi is short, and the outline is straightforward. Section 1, a declaration of God's love in chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. Section 2, a disapproval of unfaithful priests in chapter 1, verses 6 through chapter 2, verse 9. Section 3, a rebuke for social sin in chapter 2, verses 10 through 17. Section 4, a prediction of two messengers in chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Section 5, a rebuke for religious sin in chapter 3, verses 7 through 18. And then section 6, a declaration of final warning in chapter 4.